Good evening, everyone, and thank you to those who have been waiting patiently in the waiting room. Welcome to the Nova Southeastern University, Halmos College of Arts and Sciences. My name is Farah Amro. I serve as the Graduate Admissions Counselor at the Department of Conflict Resolution Studies at NSU. Joining me this evening is my colleague, Megan Troy, Assistant Director of Graduate Admissions. Megan and I are very pleased to have prospective students, current students, and guests joining us tonight. Before we begin, I want to just briefly go over the session, how it will work today. It's going to run for about an hour. Our presenter will begin her lecture, and then after the presentation, we're going to open the chat for questions. If you have a question at any point during the presentation, please feel free to type it in the chat. Toward the end of the session, we will address as many questions as time allows. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Charlene Spence. Charlene is a PhD candidate in conflict analysis and resolution here at Nova Southeastern University. She earned her bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Central Florida and later completed a master's degree in cross-disciplinary studies at NSU. Her research examines Indigenous resistance to energy poverty and environmental injustice, with particular attention to how historical narratives and policy discourse shape contemporary policy decisions and media narratives. Charlene's work combines the discourse historical approach with arts-based research methods to explore how dominant narratives reproduce structural power and how creative practices such as murals, poetry, and narrative arts allow communities to assert identity and challenge those frameworks. Her presentation this evening is titled Seeing What Text Can't Say: Indigenous Resistance and Creative Approaches to Power. Please join me in welcoming Charlene Spence. Charlene, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Farah. I know that was a mouthful, so I appreciate you giving that introductory of my presentation tonight. I am going to start off by sharing my screen. And okay, let me just move some things. And you should be seeing my presentation.
Yes, I can confirm.
Awesome. Okay. So before I start, I do want to uh, give you a bit more information about who I am. I know that Farah just gave information on what my presentation is going to be about, but I wanted to add a bit of personal touch. Okay. So again, thank you. Welcome, everyone. I appreciate you taking time out to join this session today. I I live in North Carolina. I am a mom of one son, an adult son, and I started in the PhD DCAR Department of Conflict Analysis and Resolution program in fall of 2021. And when I started the program, or when I would say I returned back to Nova, I decided that I wanted to approach it with a soak up everything mindset. So when I had an opportunity to participate in a global practicum, I had to jump at the chance. And so that's the photo that you see here on the screen. And I wanted to share this because for anybody on the call that your prospective students or you are just starting out in this program or just want some information about our department, I am a dissertation candidate, so that means I'm not a student. I didn't get credit for this, but this was an opportunity I just could not pass up. And the reason why is because a group of our students were taken to Switzerland, and where the professor focused on Geneva's global network of human rights, peace building, and organizational environmental organizations. And so we visited some major UN agencies, met with some professionals working in the field, and just basically learned about Geneva's role in international diplomacy. And I bring this up because this experience, what it did is it reignited a passion that I thought that I had moved on from and helped me realign where I wanted to continue to grow in this field. It also gave me a chance to build meaningful connections with my fellow students. So, again, for anyone who's considering or just started the program, I really just want to say remember that this is your degree, this is your journey, and it is your opportunity to be present. I preface that please just kind of absorb as much as you can and see where that leads you because you just never know where it's going to take you. Before I start my presentation, I want to give a disclaimer. I said that I'm a dissertation student. I have finished my research. I am just waiting on comments back from two committee members and that final defense date. So my presentation will be an introduction to my study, focusing on the methodology approach that I chose, why it was important for me to choose that for my research, and the contributions that it applies to the field of conflict resolution. And then I wanted to add a touch in there about how I organized myself when I started collecting data and prepped for that analysis. So I'm not going through my results or any recommendations, but it does give you an idea of where my research stemmed from and what it's all about. So I wanted to add a personal connection to this research. When I was younger, many of my early memories are tied to feeling silenced and invisible. And this umbrella that you see is not just a picture that I just decided to add. It was the actual object that was used, simply just placed in front of me to make me still and quiet. And what I realized as I grew up into an adult, it what that did is that it taught me to hide my voice and to make myself smaller. And that experience actually shaped my confidence and how I communicated. It took a very long time for me to reclaim my voice, and it's still a conscious choice. But I don't say this to try to place blame. I bring this up because I know that the act was not intentionally trying to cause harm, but that's exactly my point. Actions often are taken without that desire to cause harm, yet harm still occurs. And this often happens because I feel that we focus on what's directly in front of us without considering those ripple effects. So, I wanted to talk about the inspiration to my research. I was watching a television show and a reporter was on there and she was talking about the Bennett freeze. And it piqued my interest and I got really excited. So I started to dig into what this topic was about. And what I learned is that in 1966, Robert L. Bennett ordered a federal action that halted development of roughly 1.5 million acres of Navajo Nation land during a dispute between the Hopi tribe. It was framed as an administrative step to manage that land dispute, so a form of conflict resolution. But that policy led to decades of restricted housing, infrastructure, and development mainly isolated to the Navajo community. Although it was lifted in 2009, that social and economic impact lasted far longer. So when you think about Bennett Freeze today, a lot of people cite that as an example of federal policy that prioritized land adjudication over human well-being. So first, let's think about what is energy poverty. You may also hear it referred to as energy poor or fuel poverty. But the United Nations Development Program defines energy poverty as a lack of adequate, reliable, and affordable energy for lighting, cooking, heating, and other daily activities that are necessary for welfare and economic development. And in a similar vein, the Efficiency Canada, which is a national organization focused on advancing energy efficiency in Canada, states that energy poverty is a situation in which households are unable to access adequate energy to maintain that well-being in the home. And so addressing these issues are clearly important. However, one of the challenges is that there's no universal consensus on how to define energy poverty. And so this lack of agreement can create that tension among policymakers who are trying to understand and respond to the problem. So, to give some context to the scale of the issue, the UNDP reports that 1.8 billion people are energy poor, unable to use electricity effectively, which is 60% higher than 733 million people lacking electricity connection. And this was reported in as of 2020. Sorry, I was going to say 2022, 2020. But one important point I do want to state is that UNDP focuses on developing countries, but I use this so that I can frame how energy poverty is presented in a global context. So it just basically highlights the scale of the issue. Okay, so what's the problem? When we looked at Bennett freeze, when you look at Bennett freeze, it reveals how historical policies can shape generations' access to infrastructure, which highlights a broader patterns of environmental inequality and energy poverty. Marginalized communities often face systemic barriers to affordable and sustainable energies. And while policies aim at addressing these issues, they can unintentionally reinforce existing inequities because those frameworks are shaped by long-standing power structures. Traditional policy evaluations rarely center the lived experiences, so they're overlooking how people adapt, how they resist or challenge these decisions, which then creates that conflict, right? So on the previous slide, I talked about the definition of poverty, energy poverty. So let's reframe that now and talk about energy access, which is the focus on providing electricity and clean cooking resources to meet and our basic needs and improve our quality of life. Now, framing the issue as access can emphasize empowerment, but it also has a discursive effect. And it may obscure structural and historical causes to the issue. And what that does is it shifts the attention away from the benefits, it shifts the attention away from who benefits and who is excluded. So energy poverty and energy access, they're closely linked and they're embedded in politics, power, and social justice, revealing how policies affect who gains and who is excluded. And so again, understanding and addressing them, looking at both the material conditions and the narratives guiding the policy and the responsibility of it, you're creating a path toward energy equity. So I want to talk about my research objectives. In my dissertation, I'm exploring state-led energy agendas that are unfolding in three countries shaped by settler colonial legacies. Those three countries are the United States, Canada, and New Zealand. I'm looking at the reproduction of hegemonic structures. I'm examining those policies and media discourses that sustain those conditions alongside the communities that are creating counter narratives and those transformative potentials. All right, so I want to take a step back for a moment and look at four key themes from a discursive lens. Audre Lorde is a feminist, a poet, a civil rights activist, and I like this quote from her where she says that the master's tool will never dismantle the master's house. So starting with one of the first themes that I have, oops, sorry, let me go back. There we go. And it's being stubborn with me with my clicks. I'll get this, guys. There we go. Okay, so first we need to ask, who do these policies really serve? Land equals power. And so whoever controls that power often frames those policy decisions, right? And the idea of the greater good is commonly used to justify growth and advancement. But what if that logic is built on old systems that continue to marginalize communities? What this does is it creates a narrative loop where the same justifications are repeated and then they are reemerging in our discourse as we evolve, as time progresses. So, in my research, I discovered a term called utility maximization. It's an economic concept about achieving greatest satisfaction, which explains how national or aggregate gains are often prioritized over local needs. But policies are framed around efficiencies. Policies that are framed around efficiencies can actually normalize disposition and then treat energy as a commodity rather than a right, which again is directly linked to energy poverty. And so these patterns are revealing how hegemonic structures shape whose needs are met and whose voices are excluded in energy systems. So, on contrast of that, on the flip side, you've got many indigenous worldviews who see land as sacred and relational. So they've got guiding decision making. Their decision making is being guided through principles of reciprocity, stewardship, and balance. So these perspectives, they highlight reoccurring patterns in policies that overlook that long-term community well-being. The third theme that I want to talk about is we need to recognize the colonial roots of policy narratives because the reality is that they still exist within the foundations of these countries. Political discourse is planted in colonial past, shaping social institutions, our norms, and our beliefs. And discursive strategies uphold existing power dynamics, and they even influence the way that we talk about development and progress today. And the last theme that I want to talk about is alternative narratives. And so here I'm drawing on the storytelling framework like Bell Hook's work, where we can trace the shift from dominant stock stories to concealed experiences to resistance stories and finally emerging narratives. And so examining narratives help us understand how dominant perspectives shape policy, social norms, and the lived experiences of these communities. But it also opens up a new space for more equitable ways of thinking about energy and the land that it sits on. So why is this not just a policy issue, but a conflict issue? First, it's about identity and recognition. Energy and land are deeply tied to the communities and how they see themselves. So when policies actually ignore marginalized, indigenous, or local perspectives, they fail to recognize these identities, and it's creating tension and feelings of exclusion. The other reason why this is a conflict issue is structural violence. And that's a concept developed by Johan Galton. Structural violence occurs when social, economic, or political systems systematically prevent people from meeting their basic needs. And in the context of energy policies, it prioritizes those national gains over community access that can silently perpetuate harm, even if even if there's no overt intent to hurt anyone. So it kind of goes back to my personal connection. And then finally, cultural narratives. As I talked about on the last slide with Bell Hook's framework, cultural narratives shape how conflicts are framed and understood. And those dominant stories about progress, development, or the greater good can justify unequal resource distribution and then normalize that marginalization. And at the same time, those alternatives or resistant narratives, those counter narratives, they highlight the injustice and create opportunities for critical dialogue. So when you take all of this together, issues of identity, structural inequality, and competing cultural narratives, it shows that energy poverty isn't just about infrastructure. It's about conflict issues that touches on power, recognition, and justice. So I want to move into my methodological approach, and I took a qualitative one here where I combined two methods. I looked at the discourse historical approach, and that was developed by Ruth Wodak, and I may be pronouncing her last name wrong, with her colleagues, most notably Martin Reisegel. And that is actually a sub-method of critical discourse analysis for anyone wanting to know. And then I combined that with art-based research, and I drew upon Elliot Eisner, Tom Barone, and Patricia Levy, but I'll discuss the art-based research portion in my next slide. I'm going to dive into DHA and what DHA is and how it contributed to my research. So, DHA, what it does is it helps examine how national identity, discrimination, and power are constructed and sustained through discourse, making it really particularly useful for exploring how colonial ideologies influence energy poverty initiatives that disproportionately impact marginalized communities. It really helps us understand not just what's being said, but how discourse are shaped by history and context. Now, there are some key anchors to DHA, and there's history and context, which I kind of just briefly touched on, and that is understanding the temporal and social background that informs discourse. There is an intertextuality, and that's looking at how texts reference, respond to, or build on other texts. And then you've got the big portion of it that I see, in my opinion, is the discursive strategies. And that's the way language is used to influence perception and maintain power. Now, within this, we have five strategies. You've got nomination, and that's how actors are named or categorized. So, for example, tropes, metaphors. You've got predication. That is what attributes are assigned. So, stereotypical evaluative attributes that are negative or positive traits. You've got argumentation. That is the justification for positions. So, a development of an argument, basically, or fallacies. You then have perspectivization, say that multiple times, which is the perspective from which something is presented. So, animating, now I'm getting tongue-tied, prosodies, which is pitch, tone, rhythm. So it's basically how you bring energy into feeling, into our words. So like I'm using my hands right now. And then you've got intensification or mitigation. And so that's statements, how statements are strengthened or softened. So when you're using discourse historical approach, DHA, it allows us again to trace how policy narratives, cultural assumptions, and historical power structures are reproduced through language, and that's shaping how communities are represented, and also how policies are justified over time. So now I want to talk about my art-based research portion of it. So as I mentioned, one of the key parts of my approach was looking at forms of narrative resistance and meaning making. Or maybe I didn't mention that, but now you guys know. So these narratives actually highlight social realities and collective memories that are often left out of official policy discussions. So this is where I use art-based research because, again, These scholars that I talked about before, Tom Barone, Elliot Eisner, Patricia Levy, emphasize that art, whether it's visual, whether it's performative or literary, it has a powerful way of generating knowledge. And ABR allows us to explore not just facts of a problem like energy poverty, but also the emotional, the symbolic, and the experiential dimensions that conventional methods can miss. So by using ABR, these stories, they become more descriptive and they serve as a catalyst for learning and awareness and social critique. And they show us how communities resist marginalization, how they challenge dominant narratives and create alternative ways for understanding issues like energy access. So in summary, it tells us what's happening, why it's happening, who it affects, how we might approach solutions in a more equitable and exclusive way. So I want to touch on the contributions that I found incorporating these two methods together and how it contributes to conflict analysis and resolution. And so the reason why I did that is that the framing of energy poverty and it frames it as structurally reproduced and discursively, sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied, a maintained form of social conflict. So let me kind of restate that again because I got tongue-tied. This study contributes to conflict analysis by framing energy poverty as structurally produced and discursively maintained form of social conflict. It shows how policy narratives obscure historical responsibility, how it silences marginalized communities. And so, what it's doing, it's revealing grievances that are often missed by technical and market centered approaches. So, combining discourse historical approach and art based research method highlights cultural, temporal, and lived experiences, those dimensions of conflict, situating it within contemporary inequities that where we have that long-standing power dynamic. So in doing so, the way that I feel that it contributes, it advances conflict resolution scholarship by showing how participatory creative approaches can support both conflict transformation and social repair. So I want to talk about the tools that I used to organize myself as I was collecting data. I thought that it would probably be useful, again, if there was any prospective students or people that have not reached their dissertation stage to kind of understand how I organized myself with my dissertation research. And also it explains, what I did. But what I felt like these tools did for me is that it created a baseline for my analysis. I started by centering on one policy that was specific to energy poverty in those three countries that I mentioned before, US, Canada, and New Zealand. And then what I did is I expanded outwards. So any type of legislative actions related to that energy agenda. It could have been third-party reports, but something that was connected to it, right? And then from there, I collected my media articles from any relevant sources. I even used podcast and that was covering, basically that topic. I also included hearings to capture voices of communities that were affected. And then, of course, finally, that artistic expression. While I couldn't always find artistic work that was specific to energy poverty, I did include pieces that were related to environmental justice, resistance to hegemonic structures, or land distribution, anything that was closely connected to that broader theme of my research. And then I organized all of this into a corpus matrix tracker. So in the context of my research, a corpus is simply just the full set of documents, media, and artistic sources. that I was analyzing. And so this tracker included columns for country, source type, and the categories under source type were art performance, policy formation, interpretation and enforcement, and then news. And I had the source title, I had year, I had institutional outlet, so federal news, and then I had document genre. So was it a legal case? Was it a media article? Was it legislative text? And then from there, I curated my corpus to roughly an even number of sources across countries and types. And this helped me ensure a balanced data set. Of course, I needed a code book. So I developed a code book with code categories and code names that kind of tied back to that discursive strategy. I also made sure that I tied it back to those five strategies: nomination, predication, the five that I talked about before. I wanted to make sure that I also tied them to my research questions. Now, I know I didn't speak about that in this presentation, but I did tie it to my research questions. And then any additional notes for context for me personally. And so what this did is it created a system that allowed me to systematically analyze patterns across policy discourse and narratives while keeping it organized and traceable. I started out with 140 documents, and then I whittled that down to 85, a manageable data set that still allowed me to have an effective um, analysis of it. And let me move on to talking about how I organized the art-based component when the source was art installation or visual work. Because for that, since it wasn't textual sources, I had to approach that a bit differently. Um, because you can't really analyze pictures through a qualitative software, right? So I did structure this similar to the textual documents that I gathered. Similar columns like country, year, source type. But what I did is I added in several additional elements to capture those unique qualities of the art. And that included a formal description of the work. Um, I had to manually code this, so that was part of my analysis. But again, because it's a picture, it's visual, I did have to do the manual coding for this. Well, technically, I did do it in the software too, but you know what I'm talking about. Or I can elaborate if there's questions on that later. The other items that I added was an emotional register. So how did I feel? Did I feel angry? Was I sad? I wanted to add in artist's viewpoint, but that was last because I did not want that to impact as the researcher, my interpretation of it. And incorporating again all of these elements, I was able to create an organizational system where I'm operationalizing all of this so that I can engage with the work and I'm honoring its expressive and experiential dimensions. So this approach, what it did, again, is it allowed me to explore not just the content of the artwork, but also the symbolic, the emotional, and the narrative significance in relation to energy justice, resistance, and that environmental inequality. So I know this is kind of hard to see. I'll zoom in a second. But after I collected my information, I had to do kind of like some pre-prep before I actually started doing the data analysis. Now, I want to preface by saying that I'm not promoting this qualitative software. Um, I chose Max QDA. And going back to like the initial introduction to myself, where I gave you a personal insight of being part of that global practicum and how I was able to connect with some fellow students, I learned about this software because I connected with a student. I attended his dissertation And I had reached out to him after that. And later on, he sent an email to not just myself, but other students about this software because there was like a discount, a student discount or something like that. And I think Nova may have a connection with some qualitative software where you can possibly use their license. I'm not sure, but again, this was just my decision, my preference. I did my own research on what I wanted to use and what I felt was could be best for me. But MaxQDA, it is a qualitative data analysis software designed for mixed methods and qualitative research so you can organize yourself, do the coding, and analyze the data. But what I learned is that I was thinking ahead. I was thinking, how do I want to analyze this data? And I learned that I could create what's called a variable list in this software that allowed me to automatically analyze the codes by source type. So the source type again was art, performance, policy formation, interpretation, enforcement, and news. But it allowed me to automatically analyze the codes by source type rather than having to manually sort my documents within the software to eventually get that visual output, right? I, of course, had to develop that code book that I talked about, but I learned that I could develop it outside of the system again and import it into MaxQDA. And again, that just allowed me to streamline the coding process and maintain consistency across the data set. Let me see if I can zoom into this and hopefully you guys can see this. But this is a screenshot of the system of where I imported my code variables. This is what it looks like where my Excel file read exactly how this looks. So I set up the columns the way that it needed to be imported into this software. So it shows my country and that source type. And then you've got over here, I wanted to show what my code system looked like in the software. And again, I was able to import that code system in so I didn't have to manually add it myself. And then I wanted to show this because I thought it would be cool to show. And again, it may not be as clear, but when I started to analyze the data, or let me say, that visual output of it, this was how I was able to use that variable list, that I was able to then select which source type I wanted to analyze. And then it was only looking at the coding from that particular source type. So when the output came, it was just specifically art performance or specifically policy formation. Okay. All right. And then quickly, I'll just touch on my actual data analysis process. It was an iterative process. I began with keyword searches. Um, I will admit that I had a bit of adult tantrums. My son can actually attest to that because it's a long, drawn out process. But I'm happy I did it. But I began with keyword searches that I tied to each code structure. I had a very elaborate code structure. And so I put those keyword searches in there. So if I had persuasive strategies and it was structural inequalities, that was the subcode, then I had keywords that tied back to that coding. So I did those key searches, found the relevant passages. I then looked at those passages to see if whether that keyword and the sentence structure fit within the context of that code. And if it did, then I kept the coding where it was. If it didn't, I then readjusted it so that it fit where I felt that it needed to go. And so I did that. I also kind of used MaxQDA's AI assistance just as a supporting tool to help me identify patterns and also confirm the coding consistency. But I do want to say that all the interpretation and the final coding decisions remain grounded in my analysis. So that is an overview of the introduction to my study, basically why it was so important for me to tackle this topic. and how I feel those methods, the combination of DHA and ABR, really fit with looking at this from a conflict perspective. And I want to end on a creative approach to my research. So I didn't show any of the pictures, the visual presentations that I used in this presentation. I will kind of share that in my dissertation defense when I'm actually talking about results and those type of things. But I did want to share a poem that I do have in my dissertation. And this is a poem from Dr. Aboy Flavian Kaka. He is a prominent Adivasi, if I said that correctly, rights activist, poet, and social anthropologist. He is known for advocating for Indigenous identity, land rights, and social justice. And he's from the Kuriku, or I saw that it's also called the Orient tribe. This is in India. And I thought this was a great example of creative resistance because throughout my presentation, I've discussed how dominant policy narratives shape the way energy poverty is understood and addressed, but that our artistic expression can really challenge those narratives. And it really brings forward the voices and the experiences that are absent in policy discourse. And so, what this poem does is it shifts the focus from institutional language and it highlights the power dynamics embedded in energy poverty discourse and invites us to reflect on whose stories are heard and whose are overlooked. Because at the core of my research is the idea that before conflict can be resolved, it must first be understood historically. And if we only analyze policy intent, then we miss policy effect. And if we only analyze the text, we miss the lived experiences. So let me just read this poem to you. I'm going to zoom in here for a bit. So he says, I am not your data, nor am I your vote bank. I am not your project or an exotic museum object. I am not the soul waiting to be harvested, nor am I the lab where your theories are tested. I am not your cannon fodder or the invisible worker or the entertainment at an Indian habitat center. I am not your field, our crowd, your history, your help, your guilt, your medallions of your victory. I refuse, reject, resist your labels, your judgments, documents, definitions, your models, leaders, and patrons, because they deny me my existence, my vision, my space. Our words, maps, figures, indicators, they all create illusions and put you on a pedestal from where you look down upon me. So I draw my own picture and invent my own grammar. I make my own tools to fight my own battle for me, my people, my world, and my Adivasi self. And so I want to leave you with this question. What might change in our understanding of energy poverty and in the policies we design if we made space for these narratives alongside traditional policy analysis? And I am going to officially end on I've got to zoom back out because it doesn't like the fact that, there we go. On another personal note and another picture, so this photo was taken when I visited Kauai end of 2024 with my son. And this is a picture from Poapu Beach where monk seals had come ashore to rest. And so the area was respectively roped off to protect them and allow them to remain undisturbed. And so for me, this image reflects a broader idea of reverence for land and the environment. And it really shows how communities can recognize that humans share space with other forms of life and that stewardship sometimes means stepping back rather than asserting control. And so in the context of my research, tying it right back in there, it serves as a reminder that relationships to land and environment are not always defined by extraction or utility, but by respect and balance and coexistence. So I really want to thank everyone that has joined. I really appreciate you taking out your time. And if there's any questions, I am going to actually stop sharing my screen.
You can keep it. It's fine.
Oh, okay,
That's fine.
cool.
Thank
Yeah.
you, Charlene. It was an excellent, passionate, and eye-opening presentation. So we appreciate that. Your work gave us actually a lot to think about this evening, and I'm sure that our audience found your insights both meaningful and thought-provoking. While I give the audience a moment to add questions, I have a question for you. I
Mhm.
know from personal experience that qualitative research can come with unique challenges because it relies more on interpretation than straightforward numerical data. And as a graduate student at Halmos College, how did you navigate those challenges? Did you receive any kind of guidance from faculty mentors? Did you use any university resources such as the NSU
Mhm.
library? And you also mentioned that you used qualitative analysis software in your presentation. How were you able to access it? How did you learn how to use it? If you can tell us a little bit about this, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So, to answer the first part of your question, yes, I would say that when I took qualitative research again, because in my master's, I actually took qualitative research. Then I got a graduate certificate in qualitative research, and I have to say I'm really happy that I had to take it again because of the years that had passed. And so, what that did is it helped me understand how to use it. It actually presented ABR, and that's why I chose that and realized how important it was to my research. But I attended dissertation defenses from other students. I remember back when I started the program, Dr. McKay had dissertation drop-ins. I would attend those. And so what that did is it helped me understand what I would need to do when I got to that point. It helped me listen to other students and how they engaged with their research when you're dealing with qualitative research and the fact again that it is so interpretive. But I relied on the training that I got when I took qualitative research, constantly being told that as a researcher, you have to remember the ethical component to it. You have to approach it from a, and I'm not using the word that they used in our courses, but I'll use my own word. But you had to kind of approach it from being able to have a good sense of self-reflection. So, in other words, you're able to kind of step back and see when you are inserting too much of yourself into the research and you're not allowing the research to kind of speak to you, that it's not being led to you. Actually, my chair said something to me when I was talking to her, Dr. Duckworth, when I started this process, and I was talking about what I wanted to do, and she had like this look on her face and I was like, oh, I'm guiding the research, aren't I? And so I had to remember the training in our qualitative research class and remember I can't guide it. And I have to remember to allow the research to speak to me, not for me to force what I want it to say. I truly need to approach it from a outside view. So basically standing over me, like looking down, like, approach it that way. As far as I think you talked about the software that I used, how I learned how to use it. I'll just be quite honest. Uh, ChatGPT became my friend. Although ChatGPT is not always right. That's where those adult tantrums came into play because I would like, how do I use this? Um, and I was like, well, that doesn't make sense. That's not what I see on my screen. And it was honestly a lot of trial and error. And I also looked, the Max QDA, which is the software that I use, they have tutorials. So I actually looked at those tutorials too. But yeah, it was a lot of, intentional work of kind of researching how to use it, how it could work for me, and kind of mold it. Because I had a lot of, what's the word I'm looking for? I had a lot of expectations that didn't actually weren't realized. So I had to learn from that and kind of pivot. I hope that answered your question.
It did. And I'm glad that you've mentioned Dr. McKay and Dr. Duckworth because they are very resourceful. They're actually the program academic advisors who anyone who's interested in this PhD, they would talk with them basically. And I'm glad they were of help to you. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
There is a question from one of our audience members. Chloe Martin is asking, she's saying, great presentation, learning so much. Question. What led to your decision to focus on the US, Canada, and New Zealand? And why focus on art and poetry as opposed to other art forms such as film, music, theater, dance, etc.?
So great question. I'm so glad that you enjoyed the presentation. So the reason why I focused on those three countries is because I wanted to look at countries that had a large Native American or Indigenous population, and also that kind of shared that colonial uh, settler colonial logic. So they basically had that shared history because I needed to be able to pull from that and show how the power dynamics, the historical legacies of colonization impacted modern day policies. And so that's why I chose those three countries. And as far as why I didn't choose films or any type of theater and those type of things, I had to think about resources that I could actually use. And I didn't know whether there were some resources where I could not use them. I would have had to ask for permission. So I had to look for resources that were out there on the web and the internet that I could use that I didn't have to ask necessarily for permission. So that's why I didn't choose to use anything like documentaries or theater, those type of artistic expressions. I hope that answered the question.
So for practicality, basically. Uh,
Yes.
Now, another question. Many countries today are debating large energy or infrastructure projects on indigenous lands. From what you've studied, what kinds of conflicts tend to arise in those situations?
So the conflicts that I see that arise in them is kind of going back to the fact that those communities are feeling as if their voices are not being heard. And again, that's why I incorporated both the DHA and the ABR into it, because that creative expression allows them to kind of um, change the narrative and to show who they really are. Um, I think a lot of times what you see when communities feel like they are being marginalized, again, it goes back to they are they're not being looked at as human beings and they're being dehumanized. And so they really want to reclaim that back. They want to have that recognition to be acknowledged that, the land that they have lived on, that they have nurtured, and that they feel such a connection to, that it's not being taken for granted is not really the right word, but it's being respected, you know? And so some of what I learned through this research is that it's about not normalizing um, dehumanizing people. The way that we can speak, the way that we take kind of like that colonization mindset, those colonial ideologies, and how they constantly are kind of embedded into our policies, into the way that we present ourselves. It's just a matter of just kind of like fighting those narratives and pushing back. And again, everything I realized, and this was something again Dr. McKay taught me in one of my classes is that conflict usually centers around identity and power.
Thank you for the remarks, Charlene. They make a lot of sense in the world that we're living in today. Badr is also telling you, I do not have a question, but want to thank Charlene for the amazing presentation. Sharing the data collection and analysis process were very helpful. Good luck on the defense. Now, I do want to encourage our audience that they can ask questions to Charlene, but we're also here, Megan and I, to answer any questions that they might have about the program as well. You're welcome, Badr. And then also a question to you, Charlene. I know that there are several doctoral programs that offer, conflict analysis and resolution, several universities offering this program. Why NSU? What drew you to NSU and this program specifically?
Oh, I love that question. And I'll try to keep this brief. So when I started my master's, at that time, I was kind of trying to figure out what I wanted to do, where I wanted to take my my academic career after my bachelor's. And I found NSU. And at that time, it wasn't called Halmos College. It was not, the department was not called DCAR. It was actually, I'm going to try to remember, it was SHSS, School of Humanities and Social Sciences. And I think it was like Farquhar, something like that. I don't know. Now I'm thinking of Shrek. Anyways, and when I started in that program, and I keep saying Dr. McKay's name, but it was a directive study that I took with Dr. McKay because we both shared the love for anthropology. And of course, anthropology is so tied to culture, right? And a human factors class that I took with, and she doesn't teach at the university anymore, Dr. Marcia Sweetler. And it was that impact, the impact of being able to have a degree in cross-disciplinary studies where I could figure out where I wanted to go. I was looking at conflict, I was looking at family systems, and it was the way that I think those classes hit me, why I came back to NSU. And I came back, one, also because of convenience, but I have to say I like the RI component of it because it allowed me to meet my fellow scholars. And again, that global practicum, I cannot stress how impactful that global practicum was for me. And it's the connections. It's the connections that we make. It's the professors. I mean, I could name, I'm naming people that are on my committee, but I'm not biased. But, Dean Cooper, she brought back joy in me when it came to qualitative research, again, that I did not know. And it was when I took my qualitative research too, that I was like, oh my gosh, I want to incorporate art-based research. That's definitely what I want to do. So in summary, it's the faculty members. It was the way that the program was designed. It was the RI component. It was the global practicum. And lastly, it was the connections. And that's why I said in the beginning, take advantage of every single event that you can and build those networks with your fellow scholars because they bring different perspectives into this. I had people in my class that were police detectives, people that work in HR. Like this field of conflict analysis and resolution draws in so many different individuals and you get a different perspective. And it's like a picture of the real world. Because the real world is not just the same, right? It's different people, different cultures. And that's what I think NSU brought for me.
Thank you so much, Charlene. We're happy and we're proud to have you in the program. And to add on to what Charlene was talking about, practicum experiences, students actually in this program can complete 2 practicum experiences, which may include internships, teaching and training practicums, global practicum opportunities. And these placements can occur in settings such as education, legal systems, community organizations, or corporate environments. Now, Charlene, since we don't have any more questions and we're coming towards the end of the session, I want to thank you again for this engaging presentation. We're grateful that you joined us this evening. Megan, we appreciate you being here with us tonight. To everyone who attended, we're very glad that you could join us and appreciate your interest in the Department of Conflict Analysis and Resolution here at Halmos College. Before we wrap up, I would like to also remind everyone that if you are interested in learning more about the PhD in Conflict Analysis and Resolution, we will be hosting a virtual open house on Monday, March 30 at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. The session will run for about an hour and will give you the opportunity to learn more about the program, to meet faculty and ask questions about the curriculum, research opportunities, and the admissions process. If you have not yet registered, we encourage you to do so. You should have received an email with the registration link, but if not, we will be sending a follow-up email in the next few days that will include the link to register. The open house is one of the best ways to learn more about the program and determine whether it aligns with your academic and your professional goals. So we hope to see many of you there. With that, we'll go ahead and conclude today's session. Have a wonderful evening, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks.